Hello and welcome to the Mobalytics patch 11.7 High-ELO tier list. I'm Danox Harrison and it's been a while since we've released one of these, so there's a lot to dive into with discussing where the meta is right now when it comes to high-ELO solo queue games, so let's get stuck straight in. Starting off with the top lane, in the God tier we have Urgot, Darius and Camille, and in the S tier we have Aatrox, Gnar, Riven and Aurelia. Currently the top lane meta is pretty heavily dominated by AD bruisers. Typically they revolve around really powerful 1 to 2 item spikes, which if they obtain with a lead, then they can use to snowball the game. Tanks aren't terrible, but ultimately AD carries are just scaling too well and can deal with them too easily, so the ideal window to deal with them is in the mid game before they have too many items and with these AD bruisers who can just annihilate them. On this patch we saw changes to Trinity Force, which made it a much more appealing pickup as they trimmed the attack speed and added extra attack damage and a mix of stats on the mythic passive, and finally the ability to stack threefold strike on towers. For champions like Aurelia and Jax, this is a great improvement. Yorick also saw some positive changes which have made him a menace in lower elo, and although he's performing better at high elo, he's not quite getting the same results as players tend to be better at dealing with him and playing around his maiden. Now moving on to our highlight picks, first up is Urgot. Urgot functions really well due to how bulky he becomes and the raw damage output he has. Dealing with bruisers is something that he can do really effectively, as getting up close to him is difficult to deal with his flip and shotgun knees. His current itemization follows a trend of being monstrous in the mid game. Titanic Hydra syncs really well with his W purge, and Stride Breaker allows him to get on top of targets easier and keep them in range. In teamfights he isn't the best at diving due to his lack of mobility, but he's great at shredding front lines and generally being a nuisance. If you manage to get a kill with your ultimate, the AoE fear is extremely powerful and you can utilise your flash to reposition it into the middle of the enemy team. If you are wanting to get onto a higher priority backline target, my advice is find a flank, because wading through the enemy team's front line is going to be difficult. Camille is the biggest benefactor of the Triforce changes. She suffered a bit with the itemization changes earlier in the season, as she's always been one of the champions who synced best with Triforce, but the massive amount of attack speed it contained didn't suit her. The extra AD it now has and the extra ability to take structures has put her back up to God tier. Camille is really hard to deal with as she scales incredibly well on the side lane, but also can be a devastating force in teamfights, able to dive in, isolate carries and basically one-shot them with her Q2. The thing is, a lot of scaling champions in the game are limited by weaker early games, but the reason Camille is so powerful is because she can handle a lot of the stronger early game champions. Her passive shield and Grasp of the Undying allows her to trade effectively even into trickier aggro matchups, and a frequent trend at high elo is to run Ignite instead of Flash, allowing you to actually win a lot of all-ins early. Flash isn't too important for her as you have your hookshot for safety and mobility to avoid ganks and potentially go in deep. Gnar has been a monster for a while, with a ton of buffs over the course of many patches that firmly embedded him in the top lane meta. Although he has started to feel a bit weaker thanks to some nerfs to himself and his itemization, he's still in a really solid position. I would be cautious about blind picking him, as there are some matchups in the top lane you wouldn't want to end up in. He tends to be a huge force to be reckoned with as he scales well into the side lane and is also capable of devastating teamfights with his Mega Gnar. A common strategy for him is to basically use your ult of cooldown whenever you have Mega, as it's only 90-second cooldown at rank 1 and it can easily help you win out trades over your opponents. The trick with Gnar is harass them in mini, and then when you go Mega, you basically win all-ins against almost any champion just due to the raw amount of base stats he has available. Now onto the jungle. In the God tier we have Hecarim, and in the S tier we have Volibear, Lilia and Udyr. With the jungle meta at the moment, the priority is clearing fast and controlling mid. If you can look to find an advantage there, you can then use your mid lane as priority to transfer pressure to the side lanes and have them join you on those plays. Early skirmishing power is critical, and there's a few tanks who excel at that as they're consistent and easier to pilot. There is still windows for champions like Lilia, but the burden of execution does tend to be higher even though the payoff can be huge. On this patch we did see attempts to tone down Hecarim, Udyr and Lilia, but they didn't really make too much of a dent and they're still top performers. And speaking of Hecarim, he has had those back-to-back nerfs. The biggest reason people are still having issues with him is how cheap his itemization has become once you started building tank. Prior to this, people were going Triforce, and although it gave you a lot of burst, it made you squishy and vulnerable. Currently Hecarim is able to dive your backline and still deal out a large amount of damage, but there's limited recourse to deal damage back to him until your AD carry has managed to ramp up, and even then it's hard to retaliate when you get knocked around and feared. Hecarim's clear did get toned down, but it's still passable, and his success really comes down from his ability to engage and gank. Any overextension, no matter how slight, presents an opportunity, and even warding isn't hugely effective unless it's a deep ward, as he's able to cover a large distance in a small amount of time. Volibear is a really solid skirmisher, but prior to 11.6 he couldn't really keep pace with the jungle meta, and with a massive buff to his clear he is now a dominant force. His ganks are simple yet effective. Run a target down, stun them and chomp them. It's hard to mess this up, and the consistency allows you to continue to apply pressure. In the mid game you become incredibly tanky, and access to your ultimate means dives are super easy. A big aspect of high elo games is how frequently they'll look to execute dives. It's why Pantheon support used to be so powerful, as he made tanking towers trivial, and Volibear functions in a similar way. Point and click stun and the ability to disable tower shots means there's no good place to hide other than your fountain. Nidalee for a long time has been our big high elo menace. She's very much a feast or famine champion, as fallen behind she doesn't really offer too much, and to combine that, if you're missing spears your impact is drastically reduced. However, if she gets rolling and has powerful lanes to set her up, she's incredibly oppressive. Her clear speed is huge and she's hard to pin down, allowing her to counter jungle and keep the enemy jungler behind and under leveled. She's definitely a harder one to execute with, which is why her win rate is typically low in solo queue, but she's notoriously effective in the hands of a challenger jungler who knows what they're doing. Having hard CC in your solo lanes goes a long way to allowing you to easily land spears. In the bot lane it's pretty common for a support to have this, but picks like Twisted Fate in the mid lane and Renekton top can open with the crowd control, you land your spear, and then Nidalee's Cougar form execute damage is almost always enough to take out the target. In the mid lane, in the god tier we have Twisted Fate, and in the S tier we have Tristana, Annie, Ahri, Viego, Kassadin, Galio, Talon, Yone, Victor, Kiana and Katarina, so a ton of champions really performing strong at the moment. Everfrost did get toned down this patch with the damage and cooldown being nerfed, but even despite that it's still a really powerful tool with champs being able to layer it with their own hard CC. A big factor in the mid lane meta at High-ELO is being able to secure priority and roam, moving first to contest scuttles, rotate to dives bot and find a numbers advantage. Some picks achieve this with kits that allow them to traverse the map quickly like Galio or Talon, some it's down to strong wave clear like Victor, and for others it's being able to challenge your lane opponent and put them behind like Yone. Yasuo got a buff to his AD growth this patch, and considering how well he scales with AD due to his crit passive, this actually had a pretty positive change and put him in a decent position. Getting shield bow also makes your dueling really powerful with a great mix of attack speed, AD, lifesteal, crit and a shield to keep you alive, which just makes it a great one item spike for a champion who scales incredibly well. Kiana got some moderate buffs in the patch, and High-ELO players have started to frequently pick her up in tandem with Prowler's Claw. It gives her a huge burst window and you can essentially one-shot squish your champions. A big factor that also came into play was the nerfs to Seeker's Arm Guard, which definitely limited her ability to find advantages mid. She's solid at achieving priority as a Q can shred waves, and she absolutely excels in skirmishes. Our High-ELO experts all agreed she is super powerful at the moment. A lot of assassins can struggle in teamfights if they can't get backline access, but Kiana's ult can single-handedly win fights. Ideally, you want to bait the enemy team into fighting you in tight corridors in the jungle, and then it becomes almost impossible to win fights from that position against a Kiana, as you can guarantee the stun and some huge damage. And because it travels all the way around the terrain, you don't need to get up close until you've landed the ultimate, and often if there's heavy peeling supports like a Lulu, like a Thresh, you can use your ultimate to find a window to get in, get that backline access and blow up the enemy AD carry. Twisted Fate has always been an excellent solo queue champion. His ability to roam is unparalleled, and with a point and click stun he comes in clutch in skirmishes, particularly if he has a powerful jungler following him up. Everfrost means it's even harder to find a window to punish him, and his ability to lock down a target is extended. With TF it's as simple as finding priority and moving on the map. A big difference between high-elo and low-elo is that the lower ranks they don't respect the roam pressure, which does make them vulnerable and essentially easy targets. However, even if the enemy team does start to back off when you leave lane, it still provides pressure. You can move into the jungle, throw down a ward or clear a camp, and just that can force the enemy team's side lanes to play defensive. It's the power of applying pressure without committing, and it can be really effective because the moment they don't respect you is when you can look for that ult and pick up some easy kills. Ahri has a really solid build right now with Everfrost, Cosmic Drive and Lucidity Boost giving her tons of ability haste, mobility and pick potential. In the laning phase it's as simple as spamming Q to find priority, and when it comes to skirmishes, landing the charm and locking down a target gives you a huge advantage. Everfrost allows you to chain the CC similar to Twisted Fate, and if you chain charm into Everfrost, you only have to wait a couple of seconds to charm once again if you have your core items completed with just how much ability haste there is. When it comes to late in the game, Ahri excels at finding picks. Your ult cooldown isn't too high, and the massive amount of mobility means you can frequently look to catch out isolated targets. A numbers advantage is often enough to guarantee you an objective or a one fight, and if you do fail to catch a target you can easily disengage and wait a short period of time before your ult is ready again. Vision is critical for this, so look to control areas in advance and force the enemy team to face check. Onto AD carries. In the god tier we have just Jinx, and in the S tier we have Tristana, Seraphine, Vayne and Kai'Sa. AD carries are really powerful right now. The itemization is great and they scale incredibly well despite being relevant early in the game. Resource intensive AD carries are favoured as they have a big propensity to carry if the team plays around them, and that's typically the game plan in higher elo games. Not only is giving resources to AD carries beneficial, playing around bots secures your early dragons and results in often being able to get 2 kills rather than 1 just due to the dynamic of the lane. We did see Lord Dominic's regards get nerfed in this patch as it was such a strong item to take as early as 2nd, despite the fact it's a percent of pen item you'd expect to see into tanks later in the game. With it being toned down, it still works well when you're dealing with those tankier targets, but it's no longer rushed as frequently. Jinx is a huge carry when it comes to teamfights. His huge range and ability to get resets and chain to get the kills makes her hard to deal with when she gets ahead. Her traps got changed to activate quicker, and as a peel tool it means she has a solid answer to the AD bruisers who threaten her in teamfights. A lot of the better supports in the meta have heavy CC, and being able to chain traps with that gives solid kill pressure. Her range in AoE allows her to find priority on lane and trade well, and it goes without saying that her scaling is really good. Some of the best supports to pair with a Jinx provided with an extra layer of appeal. Thresh is a great one as his lantern is really good at allowing you to reposition to make up for your lack of mobility. Lulu is another, as those two together can easily dominate teamfights in the later stages due to the buffs she provides on top of the peel from her ultimate and Whimsy. Next up is Varus, and Varus has received a sequence of buffs, similar to how Riot treated Gnar, and eventually the sum of all of them was enough to bring him back into the meta. Currently we're back into the oppressive lethality Varus who's able to chunk out squishier targets from a distance. Kill pressure is massive in the 2v2 as once a target is low, an empowered Q can execute from as much as half HP if it's fully charged. Your ult at 6 allows you to easily lock down a target and follow up with your piercing arrow, and I think a big aspect as well for lethality Varus is that you can effectively dual squish your targets even if they're assassins, as you have enough burst to 100 to 0 them as long as you land everything. In terms of lane pairings, Thresh is another great one as he has lockdown and the lantern to give Varus mobility, but ultimately anyone who can go aggressive and land CC functions well with Varus as it gives him an easier time to land his arrows. Leona in particular has a ton of damage due to her passive, and they can take out targets really easily. Vayne's strength is her ability to deal with bruisers, assassins and the like with how strong she is at dueling and her slipperiness. With the amount being played in the top lane and mid lane, she's capable of handling herself, peeling and essentially shredding any target who comes close. With Kraken Slayer as well, there's not really much counterplay to deal with Vayne's damage other than kill her. Even as early as 2 items she can just decimate teams. Vayne does suffer from some weaker laning due to her inability to shove well and her limited range. There are definitely tougher matchups and champs with point and click CC like Twisted Fate cause issues for her at any point in the game. She does deal well with Kai'Sa and even Tristana, champs who typically excel in duels, she can actually match. In the laning phase, you want to look to find all-ins as it's a window where Vayne is powerful. Pairing yourself with a support who can help dictate those and provide early power is really valuable, especially if you're able to land a condemn into a wall. Moving on to the support, in the God tier we have Bard, in the S tier we have Rel, Seraphine, Alistar and Thresh. In the support role in High-ELO, the meta is very roam focused. It's been this way for a long time, but in High-ELO the game is dictated not just around bot lane, but who can set up for the rest of their team. You want to move and help the jungler contest Scuttle Crab. If you can snowball your jungler, then you can look to rotate mid and snowball there. Giving an advantage in mid means they'll be finding priority and able to make plays in the side lanes. It's a dictionary definition of snowballing. Seraphine is a bit of an exception when it comes to this, as her role is purely down to incredible scaling when it comes to the later stages of the game. She's just overtuned when it comes to synergy with Moonstone Renewer. Now we did see some slight nerfs in this patch to Thresh's Lantern Shield, which was mostly to target the Guardian WMAX build, which players were using to basically have a 500 health shield on demand. Rel did also get an E duration nerfed, and she's still in a powerful position, but it does mean her CC layering is a bit less oppressive. Now, Senna is a bit of a unique one. There's been a tank Senna build going around, and that's typically utilized with fasting Senna and paired with a tank in the bot lane. The build is really oppressive as you start with Frostfire Gauntlet, you become super tanky and you stack Grasp up in the laning phase to become even bulkier. The build is really effective at dealing with significant dive threat, and due to Senna's passive, you still end up putting out considerable damage in the later stages of the game. The slow pressure from Frostfire means you can fulfill a utility role and help chase down targets and peel for your backline. I will say that this build is best used when you're in a game with significant damage threats on the rest of the map. We talked before about the power of roaming in the current meta, and Bard absolutely excels at that. He's a pretty high skill cap champion, but his passive and Q allows him to easily apply pressure and set up plays, and he does a considerable amount of damage even if he doesn't build it. Your ult is effective at making picks from a large distance, particularly against mobile carries, and with Gale Force falling out of favour, it's become easier to find these windows. The power of your portal allows you to play more aggressive with your team, whether you want to push in or use it as a getaway. Most players won't chase you to the portal as it's the easiest way to get stunned on the way out. Alistar did get nerfed slightly in terms of his damage, but due to the fact that Rel and Thresh both got nerfed and they were trickier matchups for him, so as a result he's in a really solid spot. Often it's not the champion's innate strength but how they match up in the meta that defines them. Alistar provides solid engage and is a great frontliner. Particularly against champions like Vayne, it's very difficult for her to avoid or outplay the combo since it's point and click, and the only real window is clutch utilization of a condemn to interrupt it. For immobile AD carries, as soon as he combos them, they're in a really rough spot, in which he's going to be able to follow up with the stun from his E. Phase Rush is a great tool, as it means you can easily disengage after landing your combo, or if you're pushing in to be more aggressive, you can use the movement speed to land your E stun after stacking it. That wraps things up for our 11-7 High-ELO tier list. I hope this has helped to shed a light on the meta in High-ELO at the moment, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to let us know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe if you want to keep updated with our tier list, and fly on over to mobalytics.gg to check out the full list in one place.